Hello and welcome to Just Branding. This is episode 5 in series 1, and we have our first guest author, speaker, with us today, and we are going to be talking about brand purpose, mission, and values. So Stef Hamerlinck is a brand strategist who also runs a design and strategy firm called Ollie, and he is also a podcaster who runs Let's Talk Branding, which I've listened to a lot. And we got him on the show because he's got opinions, and they don't always align with other people's opinions. And I think that's a great person to have on the show, because as brand strategists, we all have our own way of doing things, but it's good to be look at things from a critical angle. So I'm going to jump straight into it and ask you, how do you define brand purpose, Stef?
Well, that's already a hard question, because it depends a lot on who's answering the question. But for me, brand purpose is very closely related to the why of the company. Like, why do we exist? What's our reason to exist? And it mainly stemmed out, I think, vision and mission. It's almost like vision and mission pressed together in a really short concept. That's, I think, what most people perceive as brand purpose. And then I think over the years, it kind of evolved where it took over mission and vision for a big part. And it kind of became this brand essence, which is interesting to me, where there's a lot of overlap between these two concepts, which is brand essence and brand purpose, because a lot of people talk about their brand purpose as the thing that drives the company forward. Like, what is it that drives this company? And then they answer the purpose, or often it's the same as the essence. So I'm not trying to confuse people here, but that's exactly probably where I have some beef with this, because it is a little bit confusing. And then there's even the link with CSR, corporate social responsibility, which was like the OG purpose, which was a lot of companies said, like, we need to have a corporate social responsibility, which is fine. But nowadays it has become this thing where it's not cool to be corporate. So social responsibility, it needs to be more authentic. It needs to be driven by purpose. And this mainly came from, I don't know if you guys know Simon Sinek, probably you do.
Yeah, we know of him. I mean, I don't know him personally.
Yeah, another OG.
Yet. We might have him on the show at some point. So, who knows?
Awesome. Yeah, he's like, he almost invented this idea of like the why. Start with why. What's the why? And that's a lot of purpose thinking evolves around that concept of why. And so that's a bit different from like that corporate social responsibility. But there is a lot of overlap, because most of the times you see companies that talk about, well, our purpose is also what we do for society. And so that's very closely related to corporate social responsibility, but people don't want to name it the same thing, because the one thing sounds more like it's something everybody needs, while as purpose is something that's driven uniquely by what you do. A long, winding explanation.
So how would you summarize that, Stef? How could you summarize what is brand purpose to you? Like, how do you look at it?
Brand purpose is the why. I think that's
nice.
The easiest answer.
And why do we have to ask why? What is the purpose behind that?
Well, that's like the question. Like, what is the purpose of having a brand purpose? And I'm not sure that it's always that important to have that, actually, because what I've seen, and I've done probably around 100 workshops or more now, so I kind of can see what happens or what doesn't happen. Sometimes you answer this question and you get a great answer, like, this is a person that's leading the company, or somebody that's in the company that really has a strong purpose. He really knows why this company was founded, and it wasn't just there for making money. And I think then it's really interesting to go into that and to build a brand on top of that. But there's a lot of companies that don't have this strong purpose, that don't have this strong founding story or this strong why, but they do create a great product or a great service. And so sometimes then if we are too focused on brand purpose because we think it's like we need to have this, we can't have a brand without a brand purpose, then we start inventing a purpose. We start like finding one that fits what a cool purpose looks like, and we start matching it with, like, you see a lot of cool brands like Patagonia or Tom's, or, well, there's a lot of like brands that are really strong today and have a strong purpose. And so we start thinking like, if somebody answers us and it isn't a strong purpose, we start pushing it towards something that we like to hear that is a good purpose. But that's not, if you want to talk about authenticity, that's completely not authentic, because it's, you're just literally like, that's the same as me saying, well, I'm driven by making designers feel happy or something. If that's not true, I'm just inventing a purpose to make me sound cooler, and I think that's a bit of a problem. So yeah, that's why the purpose of purposes sometimes it's not useful to have it, because you can have a successful brand without having a purpose. That's perfectly possible. There's no reason why you should have it. If it isn't like a big part of the story, then just ignore it and just focus on what product you have, and that's more than enough. Because there's a lot of research that has shown us that if we look at customer behavior, consumer behavior, they don't buy because of purpose. We might think that, or we might believe that, because if I ask you, Jacob or Matt, like, hey, do you buy brands based on your beliefs? What would you say?
I'd say sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
It's normal. I mean, like, do you buy brands that fit your values?
I think subconsciously I do. For example, Apple is the biggest one that comes to mind because of what they stand for in innovation, really, and that's what I kind of am drawn to. But when you say Patagonia, for example, like before I even started brand strategy, I didn't know they were like doing good for the earth, and that's really what their whole brand strategy was about. I had no idea. I just thought they were the outdoor brand, you know. And then that's a good example of your point, where I wouldn't buy Patagonia for what they do. But there's other great examples like Tom's, with or Warby Parker. Like, that's a great model and has been replicated so much. But I think to bring this back down to earth for small business, like, how can they build purpose into their brand?
Well, again, I think it's really important to understand that if you have something, this story or this why that really works well, that has like a interesting value to it, and it sounds like it's something you want to share with the world, and maybe it's also relevant for consumers, then by all means, like, start talking about that story. But never forget that in the first place, you need to have other cues that are more important. Even the founder of Warby Parker said, I don't have the quote by head, but he said, like, first we focused on having the best possible glasses for the right price, and we focused on having the right distribution model, and then we focused on having advertising that works, and only then did we start thinking about telling our story about the Warby Parker story and the purpose behind it. So always remember that there are fundamental layers that go beyond, before all these things that are purpose, that are more important. And then you can, if you do feel that there's something to be told, by all means go ahead. But again, like, it's really interesting to me, if you look around yourself in your room and you look at all the brands that are standing in front of you, you might not be able to say like the purpose of more than 90% of the brands that are in your room. So I think as a small business, it's even more important, because you have limited resources to think about where you're going to invest and where you're going to build your brand around. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah, I think that's one side of it.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that yeah, that's one side of it. But if you look at the other side of how it affects you subconsciously and the beliefs of the why, because if you create beliefs within the brand and you're aligned with the customers, it creates a more emotional connection, and that is why you're drawn to that brand, for example. So that's the other side of the discussion. What is your perspective on that?
I don't actually believe people join brands. I'm I'm kind of skeptical about that because again, like this is the big idea, right? It's that idea that brands are there to create loyalty and to create customers that believe in the brand, and thus they buy more, they buy easier, they become recurring customers. I don't know if that's for a lot of brands. I don't know if that's the case. And science has shown us, for example, how brands grow. It's a really interesting book by Byron Sharp. I really recommend reading it. They have looked at different categories, and they have seen that people are not like innate. We are not loyal to any brands. We tend to skip a brand every 2 years, even though the brand can be super powerful, even though it can be aligned with our like unconsciousness. It's still, we're still flipping from brands to brands. That doesn't mean that, I think what your point is about emotional, like unconsciously, is super important. I think that's actually like the essence of what branding is about. And I think that's what is so important here for designers, is to understand that a brand, a certain visual identity, it signals certain unconscious signals that trigger someone to buy. But the important word here is unconscious. Purpose is a lot more about like messaging and rational, like what's the story and do I believe in that story and does it match my story? But unconscious, there's a lot of things that are happening that are really important, and maybe that can be, for example, the way the packaging looks. Yeah, Matt, do tell.
Yeah, no, I was just wanted to come in here. So I find this, approach really, really interesting. I love the skepticism. Like it's great to be challenged. It really is. I have a quick thought. Like I've read that book by Byron Sharp, and it is profound. Like basically he flips the assumptions of marketeers and what's taught in many universities worldwide. So yeah, let's get our readers to have a read of that. It's quite technical though, I would say, for the average.
Yeah, it's like fairly academic.
Yeah, it is. It was heavy going, I got to be honest, but I got the gist of it, even my simple brain. But one of the things that I thought it may miss out, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, is one of the things that I find is that the challenge of businesses, be that a small business or a massive business, is often in leadership, right, and alignment. So one of the things that that is very hard to do is basically get a load of people to execute against something very simple, because everybody's got their views and everyone's piling in with, let's do this, let's go after this market, let's try this, let's deploy over here. So it can become very challenging. So I wonder whether or not, and this is a question really to you, is do you think the value in defining a brand purpose, yes, could eventually get to the consumer, but really the heart of it might be best served for the leadership team and then for the teams underneath them within a business?
It's definitely an interesting concept. What I tend to say is that brand strategy is that internal alignment, but brand purpose is like a small facet, one exercise, one thinking model within all of these options. But I think, yes, it's really important that you have a really clarified what this brand is about in really simple terms. I mean, in the end, at a presentation I do for a brand strategy, what I show them is a slide that has, on top it has brand platform. That's a sentence that's like, let's say, I don't know, 5 words, 6 words, something like that. You could say it's the brand essence, or you could say it's the brand purpose, for all that matters. And then I have 3 supporting pillars. And that slide needs to be like, that's the slide that everybody needs to understand. That's the slide that will align marketing, branding for the coming years. So that's really important. But I think, does that have to be the brand purpose? I'm not sure, because brand purpose is very much related to that story and that why, and that doesn't always create the right platform for certain products. So for me, it's like, it's not brand purpose, it's brand strategy. That's the difference.
Okay, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. I think it's fascinating what we're discovering. At least I am discovering in my work in strategy is there is no one tool that applies to every single business. And there is no one sort of silver bullet that you can just kind of shoot off and go, right, yeah, we've done brand. And it's constantly evolving and changing as consumers change, as companies change, as leadership teams shuffle around. You know, it's so important to kind of get that clarity. Interesting. So you see very much the purpose as the external sort of essence of the brand, and not necessarily an internal sort of driver.
Not per se that it has to be external, because a lot of like these statements, positioning statements, purpose statements are kept internally and then maybe translated externally into some kind of founding story or maybe into a tagline. It doesn't have to be externally. It's just like the fact that even internally it doesn't have to exist to have a successful brand. That's what I'm saying. It can be there, and if it's there, like by all means go ahead and talk about it. But if it's not that important, then it doesn't, it's like it's not a checkbox for every brand strategy. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think that's the problem with like this idea of Simon Sinek's, his golden circle. It's like why, how, what, the three circles. And so he says that if you don't have this, like this why, this inner thing, and you can't have a successful brand or anything that's driven. And I don't know if that's always true. Sometimes the platform can be the how or even the what.
Okay, so I think we're aligning why to like a greater purpose for the business, making doing better, or being in business for other things than money. So that's the question we're going to answer. But for a small business, it doesn't have to have this lofty goal of like donating another pair of shoes or glasses. It can just be about helping another person and really bringing that back down to your mission and aligning that with your why. So it doesn't necessarily have to have this big idea. So I think that's the other tool that could be used to help align the brand and like have a mission to do. Is to have that why, so you can always know who you're looking after and know why you're doing it. So I think that's the other side of it, rather than that big idea.
I think what's interesting is the fact that you mentioned here, and I think that is true, that if you're working with smaller businesses or businesses that are just starting, it's often easier for them to know what the why is, because or it's so close to when they actually started, or they're such a small business that they really know why they're doing this. And that's often the challenge when you come in organizations that are bigger. It seems like it's a lot harder to find out a purpose that's really honest and like authentic, because you know, these big organizations, they are like set up to work and to grow, but they are not always like aligned on what it is. And I think, yeah, for sure, a lot of smaller businesses innately have this. And I'm not saying they should ignore this. It's just like, I have worked with smaller businesses or even startups that like they were almost frustrated that they didn't have this powerful why. And I was like, guys, it doesn't matter if we're not having this. Like, let's look at what consumer need you're solving and if that's the right solution for them, and let's build a brand around that, and don't worry too much about this purpose. Because all the books we're reading is like, we see all these amazing brands with all these amazing person, and like every brand starts asking me like, do I need to do a 1-for-1? And I'm like, no, chill, man. Just do the proper thing. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No, it's all. I mean, I was just going to come in there and say, could I, you know, would it be facetious of me to say that that actually what you are actually helping those smaller businesses do is find their purpose. It's just that the purpose is not as lofty as perhaps some of these other brands who've gone crazy, like Tom's, have been able to achieve. Like, I often think of like Amazon's, which is often quoted as to be the most customer-centric company on the planet or something like that. The most customer-centric company in the world or something. And you think, well, that's kind of not that lofty, right? It is, but it isn't. It is kind of like, we're just saying that we're going to kind of just serve customers really well. That's our purpose. And really, you know, that's exactly what you're saying there. The question then is, on Amazon, for example, is how they are going to do that. And they're going to get the biggest range and the most efficient website, and that then becomes their sort of strategy to grow into that purpose. So I wonder whether what you're talking about is just saying to people, look, you don't have to go too crazy with this, right? Don't go too high. I would sort of say you are talking about a purpose, but just limiting that and just kind of making that smaller, and then not developing it into some huge story that is unauthentic at the end of the day. Is that a fair summary?
I think there's definitely some truth, and it's probably has to do with like splitting hairs in terms of like what words we are using. But words matter a lot in strategy, because I do feel like taking the stress of something by calling it differently can help a lot in building a brand. For example, if I say to my client, well, this is your platform, that word for me means it's something we're going to build branding and marketing on top. It's like, for me, the metaphor works, while as purpose is something else that has different connotations, different associations, different expectations. And so I do think sometimes it matters like what we call it, because it helps in like understanding exercise. But yeah, for sure, sometimes I might be working on defining the purpose. The issue, though, is that for a lot of things, what I said, like there's a lot of cliches and things hanging around this word that are not working as much. And I think a lot of cases, clients do expect that if they read a book about why, like if they think that if they have a stronger why, like consumers will be attracted to their brand more easily. And I think that hides a painful truth that brands have to put a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of like creating content or creating ads or paying media budgets to get out there and to be known by consumers. And it's not because you have an authentic story that consumers will automatically flock to you. And I think that's important. Our role as designers or as strategists is explaining to our client, like whatever you're building, whatever story you're telling, it's not gonna be that magical that people are gonna automatically come to you. So let's also think a lot about like why this should really work.
So yeah, I was going to ask you, I took your Activate Your Strategic Brain course, and you actually went through creating the strategy for a fictional company, which was called Famu. And I think that was a great insight to how you actually go about a workshop and figure out or creating this brand manifesto. So could you give some insights into how you'd actually go through this process with a small mid-sized business to create this brand manifesto, how you get to the why, and some of the steps you go through in your workshop? I think that would be super helpful for listeners.
Sure. So brand workshop is something, I think the easiest way to like get to know the brand workshop is to buy where's the brand? Let me just, I know it's a podcast, so not everyone can see this, but for people on YouTube, this book, Branding in 5.5 Steps, it's a really good book. And there are 6 questions in that book that I also use in my workshop. So simple questions like, why are we here? So purpose, what are we here for? Who are we here for? What makes us different? Like these really simple questions that aren't like terminology we use. It's not like what is our positioning, it's like what makes us different, for example. Really simple questions. And so the workshop is just me with my client going through these questions, and we're putting post-its on the wall. I'm trying to facilitate, so sometimes I'm trying to group certain post-its, or I'm trying to remove post-its or move them to another question. It's just like getting as much gut feeling reactions out of your client when it comes about the brand, and then putting that in a workshop. After that, I go about like starting to define the brand, and that's doing a lot of research. So looking at competitors, looking at category analysis, doing customer research, so doing interviews, doing maybe some quantitative surveys, all that stuff, to really get to see like, were the assumptions made in the workshop, like the things we've told in the workshop, are they true? Can we validate them through other pieces of research? And then you start defining a story or a brand. So you start defining the values, you start defining positioning. So how do we compare ourselves to other companies? And then, like, once you have that layer of discovery, you have researched the brand, you've defined the basics of the brand, then and you've positioned the brand, oh sorry, then you start thinking about more creative executions of that. Like that, for example, if you have a purpose, it's easy to start writing a manifesto or some really interesting copy. What I tend to write, for example, these days is like a press release of the brand. And this is like, if you can have a brand strategy and then you can write a press release that has like all the aspects of the story you're going to tell, and your client can see that press release in the right tone of voice with all the right like aspects in the right hierarchy, like what's in the short title for the press release, what's in the longer piece, what's in the second paragraph. This is really brand strategy. It's like telling your story in the right order, in the right hierarchy, in the right tone of voice. And that's what's really helpful. So whether it's a manifesto, a press release, or some kind of creative touch point you're creating as the end point of like the strategy, that's really powerful. And it's more powerful than, for example, positioning statements or other things. These are of course helpful to define your brand, to start clarifying where you're going. But if you can translate that into something creative that will speak to a consumer and is relevant to them in a way that's really like sparking interest and enthusiasm, I think then you're like at the end point of your strategy and you can start building brand identity or whatever creative executions.
I think that's brilliant and very well said. So I think what you just said at the end is kind of what a lot of designers would be interested in, to see how you can actually use this document to translate it to design, so bridge that gap, which is really what this season is about. So do you have any insight of how you actually go about doing that, or like what's the next steps?
Sure. So I think it's, first off, it's really important. Like at the end of the strategy, you really need to have a feeling that everybody is aligned. Like I have this idea that if we're not almost high-fiving at the end of a strategy presentation, there's something that went wrong, because there's not like, there's still some doubt. And that's like, strategy is only as good as the execution that comes after that. So if you didn't build that platform for everyone, you're gonna have trouble in the execution. That's always the same thing. Every time I feel there is some like objections and they're still there at the end, I know we're gonna have trouble in the design phase. But okay, so that's on the side. That's really important that you feel that everyone feels aligned at the end. For bridging that gap, we have a couple of things. For example, this is something you should maybe ask Gilles Heubrecht, who is my colleague. He does this thing where it's like a mood boarding session with the client. So what we do is we have a couple of posters on the walls that briefly summarize the brand strategy. So like, who's the target audience? What are some maybe visual cliches? What is our tone of voice? Like a couple of really important things that talk about the brand and the personality and the audience. And then we have a bunch of design books on the table, can be a lot of different styles of books. And we just start flipping through these books, and the client can put like small post-its on pages he likes, or red post-its on things he doesn't like. And then at the end, we go again through it and we match it with like what does fit also the brand personality. And what we also tend to do is we have like a poster with visual cliches. So those are things that in that category, for example, are very typical, very cliche, and we want to avoid them. So when a client tells you like, wow, I want this, like this type of photography, you can point back to that visual cliches you agreed upon, by the way, in the strategy, because that's important. And you tell them like, look, this is really a cliche in your industry, so I would avoid going in that direction if we want to look distinctive, of course. So that's like a really important part. That session is where we get a feeling of what they personally like, but also we have a discussion about how it might match the brand. So it's a bit different than stylescaping, what, for example, the Future does, where a stylescape is something you present to your client. What we do is we tend to like almost create a stylescape in collaboration with our client while having the strategy in front of us. So that's the way we do that. And then after that, we present identity work. Always like we don't do any iteration. So in the last, I think, 20 or 30 projects, we never did a second logo, or we never did a second iteration of the identity. It's not to say that we found like the golden formula for this thing, but it's crazy how much like we can just show the identity and they say like, yeah, that's it. Because they kind of already knew where it was going because of the strategy, because of that session, because they did it together. And that's really important note here is like, if you involve your client in this whole process, if you make them understand like what visual cliches are, and if they really see, then they're almost like they created the logo together with you, so they can't really like shoot it down because it's not a surprise. So that's our process. And then we go and build the whole brand experience. So identity work, website, all that stuff.
Stef, do you ever have issues where you're in one of those sessions, right? And maybe you've got 2 or 3 people who are all leaders in the company, and you're showing them your, you know, you agree the cliches or whatever it might be, and then you're going through, and then one of them says, no, I really want this particular thing. I think that really matches the strategy. And another one says, no, it really does not. And that is, you know, and they're at loggerheads. Do you ever have that? And how do you overcome sort of tensions in the room?
We have that, but we try to move those discussions like before any actual work is created. So for example, in the mood boarding session, that's where those discussions come up, and they have to come up, and they're good. It's good that they come up because you know they're gonna come up later in like design stages. And I think what's really good is the fact that one, you need to do these sessions with not just one client. If you can, like I always try to have 2 or maybe 3 people from their team, because you're gonna see the more voices that you have, like the more you're gonna have discussions internally, like no, that doesn't align with the strategy. And so you basically get people on board, and then they start having internal discussions, and they come out of it with a certain like compromise or something that aligns them. And I think that works really well. But I think the main point here is not like to avoid these things, but it's just to bring them up at the right point. For example, in strategy, I have the same thing. I do a truth session before a presentation, and a truth session is just like a session where I create, let's say, 10 posters with like really harsh truths about the strategy or things that I feel that are really sensitive, and I put them on the walls, and I just say like, guys, I have a feeling that you won't get this, or you won't do that, or you won't see this. Is that true or not? And then we have a really honest discussion about it. It's a truth session. But that's the perfect point to bring it up because it's early in the process. There's still a lot of room for improvement. But if you wait and you keep it to yourself and then you present it as work, you're going to have trouble. So I think the only way to fix this is to actually talk about it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think what you're talking about is not being afraid of opening up the creative process, which you can only really do unless you've done the strategy piece with the client and you've got that trust with them and vice versa. Yep. You've got that relationship, and now you can open up those conversations and they trust you to guide them through those discussions.
Because they know you understand their category, their consumers. And it's really interesting. I've had actually like this client that told me like, after we did the strategy, I had the feeling you understood my industry better than I did myself. So I would like let you do anything because I know you got this, because I know you understand my industry like almost better than me, or at least you have like a perspective that's so valuable to me. I think if you can create that feeling that it's not about you and your design and your world and your like little discipline of branding, but it's about their understanding their company, their business, their needs, then they will really trust you. And then you can have these discussions like, look, I know this is your preference, but it's not the best way forward for the brand. And do you remember what we agreed upon for the brand? Yes. Then can we move forward with this? I've had clients that said, I hate purple. I really freaking hate purple. But we agreed that like we needed a color that wasn't this, and this color because these competitors had that color. We agreed that we needed that personnel. We need to have a bold, and all the check boxes were there. And I said, like, if you look at all these reasons, can you deny that this is a good color for the brand? And he said, like, no, I can't. Let's just do purple then. And it's funny because we still make a joke about it, and he can laugh with it, but he knows that it's successful and the identity looks well and distinctive. And so it's really this process where you're not a scientist, but you do have like a really process to get there, and that helps a lot in like removing these discussions.
I think the key word you said there was process, and that's really what strategy is about, having that process and the way to facilitate information from the client. So
Absolutely.
I think we have, you've shared a lot of knowledge and a lot of insights, and I think it's a good time to wrap up this episode, unless you had any closing thoughts or plugs that you want to say for our audience.
Maybe one thing, I just, like yesterday, I just published this, so maybe it's a good thing to wrap it up. Like I just created my own definition of brand strategy, and that's maybe like a good way to end this. And so I wrote down like brand strategy is a platform that bridges, is a platform that bridges branding and marketing with business strategy. And so just to clarify, I think that's why it's so important is, again, this idea of it being a platform, what we've talked about. Like a purpose is maybe a part of that platform, but it can be something else. But it's a platform that bridges business strategy, so understanding all the things that revolve around the business model, the market, and so forth. And it bridges that with branding and marketing. So it's really important. I think for designers, this is something I struggle with, to be honest. Like first, for me, brand strategy was a way to do better branding. But the problem is, brand strategy for clients actually is also a way to do marketing. And marketing has like all these other really important things we need to learn about: distribution, price. It's not just about promotion. So once you understand that brand strategy is that, you can maybe start learning a little bit more about marketing if you want to offer brand strategy as a service that isn't just related to branding. Because I think that's fine if you want to do better design. Brand strategy will help you do that. It will help you gain trust with your clients. It will help you charge more. But if you then want to level up to that level of like doing brand strategy that is really really valuable for the business on a higher level, then it's really important you also start learning about marketing. And voila, that's something I wanted to share.
That's a brilliant way to close out. Thank you so much. So for our listeners, go check out Stef's website, which is Let's Talk Branding, as well as the podcast. Tons of guests or guests on there to listen to. So definitely go check that out. And we'll link to all of his stuff in the blurb as well. So did you have any closing things, Matt?
I just wanted to thank Stef for his time and for his views and for coming on the show. It's been fantastic to have you, and we love your sort of challenging of all the cliches and all the junk that floats around. We're unfortunately getting to a point where brand, has an identity crisis, which is a bit ironic, really. So thank you for cutting through some of that for us today, and thank you for all your insights. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you over the coming years, and maybe we'll have you back on in a few years.
Awesome! I'm honored to be on the show. Thanks a lot, guys. This was really fun.
Thanks, Stef.